Hello and welcome physiology students to the Hormone and Hormone Systems workshop. Before jumping into the PowerPoint, we're going to talk a little bit about what makes up your endocrine system. And we'll focus a little bit on the brain itself here because that's where kind of the starting point lies in the endocrine system with the area known as the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will release what we call releasing hormones or releasing factors that act on your pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is a little tiny pea-shaped gland that sits in your sella turcica of your sphenoid bone. It's divided into an anterior portion and a posterior portion depending on what hormones each part secretes. Let's focus on the posterior pituitary gland first. This posterior part will secrete two hormones, your antidiuretic hormone, which acts on your kidneys to help regulate water, fluid, blood levels in the body. It actually works to retain water and sodium in your blood. So if you've lost a lot of blood or you've been in some sort of accident, ADH will be released and act on your kidneys to regulate those water levels. The posterior pituitary, the second hormone it secretes is oxytocin, and that acts on the uterus to stimulate labor contractions during labor and delivery. If you remember, the uterus is a smooth muscle organ. So that means that it's involuntary. So those contractions happen despite what anyone thinks without you knowing it. So oxytocin will be the hormone that acts on the uterus to stimulate labor contractions. Then we have several hormones that are released, 7, from the anterior pituitary gland. Prolactin has the word lactate in its name. So this hormone acts on the breast to produce milk for lactation. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is often abbreviated ACTH, and this will act on the adrenal cortex in the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands lie right on top of the kidneys, and your adrenal cortex will release what we sometimes refer to as stress hormones, like adrenaline, epinephrine, to get your body ready to respond to a stressful situation. The next hormone that your anterior pituitary gland secretes is growth hormone. And you can imagine what growth hormone does. It'll act on all of your body's cells, metabolism, to increase in size or grow. So growth hormone will be really important and effective during puberty. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, acts on your thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormones such as thyroxine. And these thyroid hormones stimulate growth, metabolism. They also help to regulate your nervous system, digestive system. Your thyroid gland is a really smaller type gland, and these teeny tiny hormones can have a huge effect on a person's body. Women sometimes have problems with their thyroid hormone levels, and we'll talk about hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism towards the end. Then the last two hormones that are secreted have to do with hormones that act on the gonads, the testes and the ovaries. So we have follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which act on both. The word follicle-stimulating hormone has to do with stimulating follicles, which are your gametes or your sex cells. So follicle-stimulating hormone will act on your testes and your ovaries to stimulate egg production, sperm production in the males, and also secrete androgens, which are sex hormones such as testosterone in the males. Then we have luteinizing hormone, which also acts on both the testes and the ovaries. Specifically, luteinizing hormone will stimulate ovulation or the release of an egg from the ovary into the uterine tube. So there are a lot of hormones, and you have to learn where they come from, what they act on, what stimulates them. And I've often found that drawing a flow chart helps me remember these hormones and where they're going and what they act on. So I would encourage you guys, if you're having problems remembering these hormones, to draw flow charts like this. You always start with the hypothalamus, and you always will start with what releasing hormone gets released. In this case, we're talking about gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that will act on the anterior pituitary gland. So your hypothalamus always releases some sort of releasing hormone that acts on your anterior pituitary gland. Specifically in this flow chart, GnRH acts on your anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This GnRH is important to initiate puberty in young adults. FSH and LH then specifically act on ovaries in females to release estrogen and progesterone. And estrogen and progesterone will both have an effect on the uterus, depending if there was an implantation of a fertilized egg or no implantation in a normal monthly menstrual cycle. So this is where we get into a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop. And because a positive feedback loop refers to a positive pregnancy implantation, this positive feedback will identify that there has been a positive implantation of a fertilized egg, and it'll tell the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, hey, keep secreting estrogen and progesterone because the uterus needs estrogen and progesterone to continue developing, to keep that developing fertilized egg safe, to act on the uterus to continue to support that. However, in a case of negative pregnancy or just a normal menstrual cycle, whereas an egg is released, that negative pregnancy gets signaled up to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and it tells, hey, you can kind of lower the levels of estrogen and progesterone being secreted because we didn't have a pregnancy. So this is just an example of how to use a flow chart to learn one of the pathways traveling from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, to the organ, the cell, the tissue that those hormones are being acted on, and then the positive or negative feedback loop and what that hormone actually does. So we'll go through a little bit of how we see some differences between the nervous system and between the endocrine system. The nervous system, the mode of transmission is always electrical to chemical because that electrical signal gets passed down an axon, releasing neurotransmitters. In an endocrine system, the mode of transmission of hormones is blood-borne. So hormones will travel through the blood to their area of target tissue. The nervous system, the messengers in a nervous system are neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine, and the messengers in the endocrine system are your hormones. The release in the nervous system is always very close to the cells of influence. You can see the release here of those neurotransmitters occurs at a synapse, which is a tiny space where those neurotransmitters will attach to the next neuron or the next muscle cell to continue that transmission. However, in the endocrine system, the release of hormones can be extremely distant from the area of the body that they actually affect. For example, thyroid hormones can have an effect on varying parts of the body. They can go to every cell of the body and affect the growth rate or the basal metabolic rate. So there's a much more distance from their cells of influence. The target cells in the nervous system are specific for a small group, whereas the endocrine system, it's a little more indiscriminate what these hormones can act on. Some can act on several different types of cells, such as your thyroid hormones. The speed of this transmission is extremely fast in the nervous system. Think of touching your hand to a hot stove. You immediately remove it because you feel the pain, and your brain knows to tell your muscles to remove your hand from that hot stove. The endocrine system is a little bit or much slower. Sometimes it can take minutes or hours for these hormones to actually have an effect on their target. The duration of the nervous system response or signaling is extremely short, whereas the duration of that these hormones have on their target cells can be much more longer lasting. A little bit more about the endocrine system. We talked about your hypothalamus. That'll control your pituitary gland, but your hypothalamus regulates hunger, thirst, sleep, wakefulness, plus most of any involuntary mechanisms, including your body temperature. Your thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormones, which are important for regulating your energy levels, metabolism, body temperature, nervous system. Your pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine function. So we include your pancreas when we talk about the digestive system because it releases digestive enzymes that help in the digestion of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, whereas the pancreas's endocrine function produces insulin, which lowers your blood glucose levels. Ovaries then and testes will influence how your blood circulates, your mental vigor, your sex drive. They'll release the sex hormones. The pituitary gland, back up at the top, controls all other endocrine glands, influences growth, metabolism, regeneration. The parathyroid gland secretes hormones necessary for calcium absorption. You might remember that from the skeletal system. The thymus helps build resistance to disease. And then your adrenal glands are located right on top of the kidneys, and they will secrete hundreds of compounds, some of which are your stress hormones like epinephrine, adrenaline, which helps you react to emergencies. And they will regulate your metabolic processes in cells, water balance, blood pressure, especially if you've lost any blood. Okay. So I'm going to pause the screen here and have you guys fill out this final Jeopardy question. You will have played Jeopardy in a live environment or some sort of activity like it to fill out those hormones and what they do on your worksheet. And if you guys want to pause the video right here, this is looking at a flow chart, and I want you guys to fill out the flow chart based on that example I gave you. What goes in the purple box, what that releases to act on your pituitary, what your pituitary releases to act on your thyroid. And you can already see here there's a negative feedback loop. So I'll give you guys a chance to fill this out. So hopefully you got something like this. Your hypothalamus is the starting point. That releases your thyrotropin releasing hormone that acts on your pituitary gland to release TSH. That acts on your thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are just the active and inactive forms of those thyroid hormones. And this negative feedback loop just means that once there is enough active thyroid hormone circulating in the blood, that level of thyroid hormone just travels up to your hypothalamus and says, hey, there's enough of thyroid hormone. You can turn off the flow chart now. And then your thyroid hormone will act on a variety of targets, muscle cells, growth, basal metabolic rate, body temperature. Then we'll get to more application questions. So I will let you guys read through those application questions, and you can pause the video right here to complete those. So GHIH is growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So we have growth hormone that stimulates growth, but inhibiting hormone actually inhibits growth. It will inhibit the release of growth hormone and also your thyroid stimulating hormone. So if we have a tumor producing too much of this inhibiting hormone, we won't get a whole lot of growth and we won't get a whole lot of regulating of all the things your thyroid hormones do. So a tumor is producing an increased amount of this inhibiting hormone, which will actually decrease the release of growth hormone and TSH, which is what our bodies always need. This will affect negatively bone, muscle, cell division, fat catabolism, and glycogen breakdown in the liver. So this will have a negative effect on everything that has to do with growth. And instead of growing, it'll break down and kind of decrease the effects of that growth hormone. TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone, affects your basal metabolic rate. That's just the rate at your cells metabolize. It'll affect carbohydrate, lipid, protein metabolism in the body, so it'll decrease those. It'll affect nervous, cardiovascular, muscular, skeletal, GI, reproductive systems, and integumentary systems, all from a tumor that is producing too much of this growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Then we get to the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And this system regulates blood pressure and water fluid balance. And this system kind of gets kicked into gear from your kidneys. if you're ever in some sort of emergency situation where you've lost a lot of blood, some sort of internal bleeding or external bleeding. So this emergency type of situation where you've lost a lot of blood, that decrease in blood volume automatically is detected from your kidneys, which regulate your blood fluid levels already. When the kidneys detect this decrease in blood fluid volume, they'll automatically secrete renin. And renin acts on angiotensin. So renin will stimulate the production of angiotensin, and angiotensin has a twofold effect. The first effect of angiotensin is that it tells your adrenal cortex, which is in your adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, to secrete aldosterone. And aldosterone is important for retaining water and retaining sodium. So aldosterone will tell your kidney tubules to increase sodium and water reabsorption back into the blood. This is important because when you lose a lot of blood, you lose blood pressure, and your kidneys will try to absorb much water and sodium back into the blood to try to get blood pressure back up. So you'll be urinating less frequently. So this will increase body fluid volume, so your blood pressure will increase, and an increase in blood pressure will help push that blood that you've lost to the major organ systems that need oxygen. The second twofold effect of angiotensin is that it has a direct effect on your blood vessels. And it tells your blood vessels to constrict, and that means the diameter of your blood vessels gets smaller. So with that, you have kind of a buildup of blood pressure behind this constricted area. And again, that increase in blood pressure is important because the more blood pressure, the higher blood pressure will help push the blood that hasn't been lost to the organs that need oxygen. That's the end. Thanks for listening, guys.